CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Juliet Mann. Our top stories. Survivors emerged from the Mariupol theatre Ukraine says was targeted by Russian shells, but the number of casualties are still to be established.
Our other headlines: Ukraine's president evokes Germany's divided history, saying Berlin must lead the way in stopping Russia building a new Iron Curtain across Europe.
The war in Ukraine could knock more than 1% off global growth this year, a stark warning from the OECD.
Russia says it's made a payment to avoid default on its debts, but creditors say they have yet to receive the funds. And
stormy seas for P&O ferries. Staff refuse to leave their ships after 800 crew are sacked.
Survivors have been emerging from the bombing of the theatre in Mariupol in Ukraine. Over 1,000 civilians are reported to have taken refuge in the basement of the building as Russian aerial strikes pounded the besieged city.
Ukraine says it hopes to evacuate civilians from Mariupol and other cities by opening 9 new humanitarian corridors.
Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Michael Voss in the Ukrainian city of Lviv. Michael, what more do we know about this bombing at the theatre in Mariupol?
Well, as you say, it does appear to have been an aerial bomb, despite the fact that in huge letters outside that were written on the street, dated children. It does seem that miraculously the basement where people were sheltering seems to have survived. They're clearing rubble, trying to clear access to the basement. Survivors are coming out. We don't have details yet of how many survivors or any fatalities. It appears people have been in there for about the past 10 days. They'd ripped up all the padding and cushions on the theatre seats, using those as bedding, and then chopped up the wooden seats for fuel. And shelling is continuing elsewhere heavily in Kharkiv, for example, the second city. They're saying it hit a cultural centre, while in Chernihiv in the north, they're saying that 53 bodies have been taken to the morgue over the past 24 hours. It isn't just Mariupol that's being heavily shelled right now.
Michael, what about these new 9 humanitarian corridors? Are they operating, do we know?
As far as we can see, most of them are. People are still coming out. I think what's happening in Mariupol, people have been escaping by car, but what they need there is some huge convoy of buses to take aid in and get people out, and that's not happening. Here in Lviv, we're still getting trainloads of refugees coming, most en route to Poland, but some are staying here in the town. And earlier, I went to visit a family who are now sheltered here in Lviv. It's supper time in the Horon household, but now with 4 more mouths to feed. Roman Lisovich, his wife and 2 children, fled embattled Irpin and are now staying with distant relatives in Lviv. Their neighbourhood was heavily shelled. Then Russian soldiers broke into people's houses and held them at gunpoint.
3 Russian soldiers went down to the basement, pointed their guns at us and asked us to go upstairs. Then they started checking our passports. For some reason, they thought we were American spies.
He told me the Russians threatened to kill them if they had American visas. Luckily, they didn't.
When we were in the basement, the Russians took away our phones and smashed them. Then they pushed the children back into a basement and made our parents go upstairs. I didn't know what would happen to my mom and dad. This was when I was really terrified.
They were part of the exodus that managed to cross the makeshift bridge amid the shelling and eventually make their way to the safety of Lviv.
After 5 or 6 days under occupation, we ran out of water. We had some frozen food, but without gas, electricity and water we couldn't cook it. So we just left the house, came up to Russian soldiers and asked if we could leave. They gave us 30 minutes to leave.
They're now sharing an apartment in a high-rise complex on the outskirts of Lviv. Everyone does manage to fit around the kitchen table. Now, the family that live here, their children have given up their room. We've got the parents sleeping there, 2 children in this bed. And what we have here is their entire worldly possessions now that they've fled their home. Olya Heron invited them to stay and is now trying to stretch her budget to feed everyone. You have a big family, a small apartment. Why did you offer them to stay here?
I just really love them. They are my family and we have to stay together. I can't even imagine how devastated I'd be if they died. I was praying for them all the time. It's a miracle that they were able to get out of there alive. The children have adopted a stray puppy, a huge comfort in their time of need, but no one knows what the future holds. For 11-year-old Alexander, the memories are hard to bear. I just want to go home, he told me. Jamie, at least this family have found somewhere to stay, but there are an estimated 200,000 refugees still staying here in Lviv. Many are staying in shelters and still trying to find where they can stay. The local authorities are saying their facilities are really stretched by now.
Michael, thank you for that. Michael Voss, our correspondent in the city of Lviv in Ukraine.
Well, President Putin has been speaking about the war in Ukraine. In a speech about the future of Crimea, Putin said that while global sanctions are causing problems for the Russian economy, they're also creating new opportunities. Now, Russia's new media law severely limits what correspondents there are able to report. Our correspondent Stuart Smith is in Moscow. Stuart, what did Putin have to say?
Well, this is the anniversary for Russia of 8 years of Crimea being part of the country. It was annexed in 2014. Ukraine still doesn't consider it part of Russia, and nor does the vast majority of the international community. But Russia says residents of the peninsula voted in free and fair elections. And President Putin said today they made the right decision. Now the recipients of around $13 billion in funds from Moscow, and it's being used to help improve the airport, improve transport links, roads and a railway bridge across to the mainland. And that money will help Crimea eventually improve its tourism, improve its agricultural output and its industry. But he admitted Western sanctions have hit the region hard and have curtailed development that otherwise may have sped things up. Businesses and banks, even Russian ones, are very reluctant or have been reluctant to invest in the region because doing so would mean they could be on the wrong end of Western sanctions. But the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, turned this around today in his speech and said actually the latest round of sanctions are a good thing for Crimea because now these banks in Russia, these businesses that had previously been too scared to deal with Crimea, are now no longer have anything to fear because they're already on the receiving end of sanctions. And so that balance, that difference between the business situation in mainland Russia and Crimea has been eliminated, and therefore they can expect investment and funds to start flowing again.
Stuart, any sign of Russia reaching a deal with Ukraine over the conflict?
The presidential spokesperson speaking this afternoon said that previous comments reported by the Financial Times about diplomacy and a 15-point plan about how this conflict could come to an end were over-optimistic, that the majority of what was published was incorrect. He said he's still optimistic, but the details, I think he believes, were exaggerated, though there are still discussions, of course, and the Turkish President Erdogan spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin on the phone about potentially hosting a meeting of the two leaders, Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky and the Russian President, in Istanbul or Ankara. He also suggested, the Turkish President, that one of the best ways for a long-term solution to this conflict would be a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire in Ukraine. But we're certainly not at that point yet. Still a lot to be discussed. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky saying last night in a Telegram video on his channel that all sorts of things still need to be worked out, from security guarantees, sovereignty, restoring territorial integrity, and real protection of the country is required. And this big one, neutrality, what does that mean for Russia? The Russian Foreign Ministry's spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, hinted at what neutrality might mean, but there's no indication Ukraine would be amenable to it. Here's what she said earlier.
Russia's demands are extremely simple and understandable. They derive from the special military operations goals and tasks. We hope that Kyiv will finally realize the inevitability of demilitarization and denazification in Ukraine and its transformation into a neutral country for the good of the people of Ukraine and the whole of Europe. The quicker representatives of the Kyiv regime understands that, the quicker the special operation ends.
These talks do continue between Ukraine and Russia, but right now the Russian Foreign Ministry says they're taking place by video call, with contact being made almost daily at this point.
Stuart Smith in Moscow, thank you.
The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Germany must help to destroy what he calls Russia's new wall in Europe. In an emotional video address to its parliament, Zelensky constantly referred to Germany's history, World War II, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the country's reunification after the Cold War. He said Russia was trying to divide Europe again. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Trent Murray in Berlin. Trent, many historic references in President Zelensky's speech today. What was his key message?
Yeah, Jamie, it was a very powerful address to the Bundestag, and I think in many ways it probably offered a lot of German lawmakers a bit of a brutal reflection, if you will, about how we got here. President Zelensky did thank Germany for the assistance it's given until now, but he also came armed with plenty of criticism, saying that for too many years Germany had ignored warnings that he and the Ukrainian government had made about just how much business it was doing with Russia, especially in the areas of gas and oil. He said, "We told you that Nord Stream 2 is a weapon and could be used for a war, but you just kept telling us it was about your economy, and now we are paying the price for it here in Ukraine with this war." It was very, very powerful language, and as you said, it was laced with plenty of historical sensitivities for Germany, mentioning everything from the Second World War to the fact that this country was divided in half only until 31 years ago. Let's just have a little bit of a listen to what President Zelensky had to say at one point of the speech, just to give you an idea of the overall tone.
We're trying to defend our country without your support. Why is a country that is across the ocean helping us more now? Because there is a wall that we apparently do not see yet. We're fighting for our people to survive and to protect them.
Trent, severing economic ties with Russia is really going to hurt, though, isn't it? A new report suggesting that Germany's economy could take a huge hit from this conflict.
Yeah, that's right, and that's certainly part of the conversations which are happening at very high levels of government here, because there are calls for Germany to completely cut off the import of Russian gas and oil, but that is very, very difficult for the country to do. About 40% of the gas used in Germany comes from Russia, so The government is resisting those calls for now, but the overall economic impact is already starting to be felt, and we are getting signs of the sort of trajectory of where things are heading. The IFW, which is a pretty respected economic institute, released this report today that you mentioned, where it cut its 2022 growth forecast by half, down to just 2.1%. In other words, they expect the German economy not to grow as much as they thought it would. And we are seeing signs of that already. Many factories across Germany from major manufacturers, including Volkswagen, for example, are slowing production because of shortages of supplies and because of high energy costs. So with the humanitarian cost very high of this war and also the economic cost very high, Chancellor Scholz put out a renewed plea today for President Putin to stop the war.
We are deeply moved by the fate of many young Russians who are being sent by their leadership into a senseless war. And I believe it to be important that what happens to these people is made known in Russia too. Because everyone in Russia has to know that only President Putin is responsible for the death and injury inflicted upon these young people.
And that bill to increase German defence spending continues to make its way through the parliament. 100 billion euros slated to be spent on the German military. The first big purchase announced earlier this week. American-made Lockheed Martin F-35 jets for the German Luftwaffe, part of many, many packages on defence which we expect to be announced in coming weeks.
Trent, thank you for that. Trent Murray, our correspondent in Berlin.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. The Bank of England tries to calm inflation with an increase in interest rates, the third rise in 4 months.
The British public not only need to know, but they want to know more about China.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers.
East meets West. We're now at a time when we need the icebreaker spirit.
My first impression when I came to China is I noticed the similarities more than the differences.
It's about understanding each other's culture.
We look at the things that bring our nation together.
My dad is Chinese, my mom is English. I grew up in London, but I went to China to work at age 25.
Whenever I've gone to China, it's just been amazingly welcoming.
The music is beautiful language and bring all the people together.
I'm exploring, I'm experimenting, I'm trying something new, all in the hopes to build a bridge. And I think we definitely need more people doing that.
It was only when I got to know my Chinese father in my 40s that I really got to know the other half of myself.
I hope we make it another 50 years, another 500 years.
Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dared to think beyond the horizon and to open up our world, on TV and online on CGTN.
I hope that you will all become icebreakers and bridge builders.
This week on Razor, a battery to store renewable energy. And a revolution in microscope resolution.
So this is the microscope.
This is where the magic happens.
Wow, that is incredible. I've never seen a microscope that big.
Most of it is used for creating a vacuum and producing the electrons.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Quick reminder, CGTN is available to watch for free on all of the major digital platforms, on Smart TV, online at Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Preview.
Global economic growth will be more than 1% lower this year as a result of the conflict in Ukraine.
That's according to the OECD, which has released a detailed assessment of the war and its consequences on world economies and social policies. Our correspondent Ross Cullen reports now from Paris.
The Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is headquartered here in the French capital, would usually at this time of year be publishing an update to its outlook for the year ahead. That's normally released around March. But Russia's military action in Ukraine has forced a change of plan. Instead, the organisation delivering an assessment of the economic, political and social effects of the ongoing conflict. The OECD warned that the war is expected to slow the global recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and further push up inflation worldwide. It says inflation, which was already high at the start of this year, would rise by about a further 2.5 percentage points across the world. The group's boss, Matthias Cormann, said the war would have a far-reaching impact.
Even though Russia and Ukraine are a comparatively small part of the global economy, the economic disruptions brought on by the conflict are large and are likely to continue into the future.
Commodity prices have risen sharply, and Russia and Ukraine together account for about a third of global wheat exports. Disruptions to wheat, maize and fertilizer output risk raising hunger and food insecurity across the world.
Importantly, beyond the Ukraine, this war risks causing further negative humanitarian impacts in other parts of the world. Developing and emerging market economies will be particularly heavily impacted by higher food prices, as the share of the population who will be unable to afford food at higher prices and is at risk of malnutrition is higher than in advanced economies.
The summary from the OECD was bleak. Along with the impact on growth and rising inflation, they warned of a commodity supply squeeze, a reduction in productivity and a hit to international trade and international investment. The OECD urged governments not to resort to protectionism, saying they should diversify away from a reliance on Russia and a dependence on fossil fuels, arguing they need to ramp up their green investment, and also saying the most vulnerable households must be sheltered from the worst economic consequences of the war. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Paris.
Russia says it fulfills an order to pay $170 million in Eurobond interest, but a number of creditors said the funds have yet to be received. The debt payments came due this week and are seen as the first test of whether Moscow will be able to meet its obligation in the wake of Western sanctions. Well, Alexander Prosvyakov is president of the private investment advisory firm Whitestone. Thanks ever so much for coming on the programme. Now, Russia says it's made the payments. How long will it be able to keep on paying?
Well, Russia indeed made the payment, but it did by issuing a payment order to use the frozen funds to pay the creditors. And about 20 minutes ago, we received information that the clearing agent processed these funds. So we're expecting to receive the coupons any minute now. I hope we do so, and I hope Russia avoids the default. The Minister of Finance said that if the agents do not process the payment, then Russia will pay in rubles, which should avoid default in Russia's understanding, but not in the international courts, the juridical understanding. Russia has the money. They have $630 billion of reserve. The problem is nearly all of the liquid reserves are frozen due to the sanctions. But apart from that, Russia is still receiving a lot of hard currency. Russian companies are selling oil to Europe, and about $550 million per day are paid to Russia. That's about $200 billion per year is the dollars, the hard currency Russia is receiving. Russia can use that money to pay. It is not frozen.
And yet, default or no default, Russia is buckling under the economic backlash from its invasion with all the foreign sanctions. In terms of how investable Russia is it uninvestable?
It is absolutely uninvestable from a foreign point of view. You cannot physically invest. Most of the investment instruments are blocked, so you cannot buy Russian assets on any of the exchanges worldwide. The banks, the brokers will not process any deal to invest in Russian assets. You can only buy Russia inside Russia if you open an account as a non-resident, but Russia blocked all non-residents from receiving any proceeds in Russia, so you cannot receive the money if you go inside Russia and invest using a Russian vehicle. So this is indeed very disturbing. Russia is limiting itself from the money that could go inside the country, could be used to invest in the country. And this is indeed not very good and very disturbing.
So you say Russia's limiting itself. What's the role then of Russia's central bank in limiting the damage from the conflict?
What Russia's central bank tries to do is limit the amount of money that could flow outside of Russia. This is why they're blocking the accounts of non-residents. We know that the Russian residents cannot send money abroad. These payments are also blocked. So the central bank is trying to keep the money inside the country. This is why we see all these measures. It will help in the short term because money will not go away. Like a lot of money will not leave Russia straight away, but it will indeed hurt Russia from the reputation point of view, and people will be afraid to invest any money in Russia given that these measures take place.
So help in the short term, but long term, more question marks. Alexander Prosvyakov, thank you.
Thank you.
The Bank of England has raised interest rates for the third time in 4 months. They're now at 0.75%, up from 0.5%, the highest level since the start of the pandemic. The bank has also warned that UK inflation could rise over 8% this year as the cost of living squeeze worsens. In the United States, the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates for the first time since December 2018. The central bank is also expecting to hike rates 6 more times this year as it tries to battle inflation, now at a 40-year high. Let's talk to our correspondent John Terrett, watching events for us in New York. John, so history made by the Fed. Tell us more.
Well, you know, Juliet and Jamie, I think you're absolutely right about that. I mean, this is the first interest rate hike we've had in America for years. I mean, 3.5 years, actually, going back to 2018. The announcement came on Wednesday, as expected. There was a news conference by the boss, Jerome Powell, as expected, and then the markets went haywire, as I told you they would 24 hours ago. And the reason is there's no real playbook for an interest rate hike after a pandemic, coming out of a pandemic, going back into a pandemic, and coming into a conflict like the one in Ukraine that we see. And also there are so many more day traders, these retail traders, than we've ever seen before, and I think they cause some volatility. Anyway, things settled down, as you will see in a minute. But the bottom line is Americans are now paying more for their credit cards, their car loans, and some of their mortgages, because the effect of increasing the interest rate is to make borrowing for everybody more expensive and slow the economy. The range used to be 0 to 25%, basically 0. Now the range is 25 basis points to 50 basis points. Not everybody on board. James Bullard, who heads up the St. Louis branch of the Federal Reserve, he didn't vote for it. He wanted it to be a 50 basis point increase. He didn't get what he was looking for. And now we're being told to look out for 5 or 6 hikes between now and the early part of 2023. Dow's up about 73 at the moment. Nasdaq's up a fraction. S&P 500 up around 10 points. And Jerome Powell saying the U.S. economy can take this. It's time for interest rate hikes. He foresees no recession. Goldman Sachs begs to differ. They've issued a statement saying they think there's a 25 to 30% chance of a recession in America because of all this in the next couple of years. Guys?
John, a word about the United Nations Security Council meeting in an emergency session once again.
Yeah, this is coming in. I think the meeting is due to begin at about 3 o'clock this afternoon, local time, 19G. I'm looking at the monitors here, and the cameras of the UN television service are up outside the Security Council chamber, so we'll see what happens. Called by 6 Western nations. As you know, the rules dictate that the Council must meet if a member asks for a meeting, and so it will be. The Western nations are the US, the UK, Ireland, France, Norway and Albania. I'm expecting it to be an open session when it gets underway, and that will be ahead of what I think is going to be a vote in the Council on Friday about Russian humanitarian issues. That'll be a resolution. That'll be on Friday the 18th. In the meantime, the UK mission has just tweeted out that Russia is committing war crimes and targeting civilians. So today, I think strong speeches. Tomorrow, look for the veto and the abstentions, as we've seen in the past. In the meantime, also, President Biden has called President Putin a war criminal for the very first time. He did it as he was leaving an event. He came back and said to the reporter, "What did you say to me just now?" And she said, "Is he a war criminal?" He said, "Yes, he is a war criminal." A long way, though, between calling somebody a war criminal and getting them into the dock in The Hague. Finally, breaking news here. President Biden will meet with China's President Xi virtually in the coming hours. This follows 7 hours of talks on Monday in Rome between Jake Sullivan, who's President Biden's national security advisor, and Zhang Jiechu, a leading Chinese foreign diplomat and thinker. On the agenda will be, I'm told, competition issues, that's trade issues, Ukraine, obviously, and other key issues between them. Guys?
John, thank you for that. John Terrett, our correspondent in New York.
UK-based ferry operator P&O has made 800 staff redundant with immediate effect and suspended services for the next few days. The company says its future is dependent on making swift and significant changes now. Well, let's speak to our correspondent Naomi Choi-Smith, who's in London for us. So, Naomi, good to see you. So, tell us a little bit more about why P&O Ferries has taken such sudden and drastic action.
Yeah, well, essentially, the company is blaming this on cost-cutting measures. P&O says it's really struggling to stay afloat as a business, especially after the pandemic. Ferries were clearly one of the industry sectors worst hit by the pandemic as passenger travel slumped. And P&O in the past year or so has had to already lay off about 1,000 people. So this is another range of layoffs that they say are cost-cutting measures that they have to do to keep their business sustainable. The company says it's lost about £100 million year on year and sees these measures in terms of letting go 800 seafaring staff in order to replace them with potentially cheaper or contractor or agency workers as the way forward in order to keep afloat at this stage. Now, we have to remember this is a very critical route. P&O operates routes between the UK and continental Europe and also uses a lot of freight trade. For example, we're reliant on P&O for about 15% of freight trade here in the UK. So plenty of disruption at the port today.
Well, what has been the reaction from the crews? 800 members of staff told just to get off the boat, and that's that.
Understandably, in the workers and unions say that they are furious, not only at being let go, but they say the method in which this was done, which was essentially reportedly over Zoom this morning, the workers were informed that they would have to give in their severance today, essentially. So the unions are standing firm. They're saying we will fight this decision, although P&O does say they will give payoffs to certain workers. There are no more details of exactly what that will contain at this stage. And we're seeing really a lot of chaos at the ports as reports are coming in of certain workers staying on the ships as they're instructed by their unions not to disembark just because they need to hold on to their rights. So there are also reports from the unions coming in that there may be people waiting to take them off in handcuffs. There's a lot of confusion going on. And the Transport Secretary here, Grant Shapps, says he'll be speaking to the company later on to minimize this disruption, to find a path forward amidst a lot of outrage at this stage.
Naomi Choi-Smith, thank you for that update.
Investors in cryptocurrency risk losing all their money and falling prey to scams. That's the warning from EU watchdogs. Banking regulators say many investors in virtual currency do not understand the market is unregulated and they may lose their investment completely. It adds few people are aware of the environmental impact of mining for crypto. Amazon says it's closed an $8.5 billion deal to buy the US media company MGM. The online retailer hopes to draw more viewers to its streaming platform, with the takeover of the famed Hollywood studios adding around 4,000 films to its catalogue. It's had to clear a number of regulatory hurdles, including approval by the European Commission. The UK government is introducing its long-awaited online safety bill in Parliament, which aims to hold internet giants accountable for any harm caused by their platforms. The bill will see the country's communication regulator Ofcom given the power to issue fines or block sites that break the rules. One of the main aims is to prevent children from accessing inappropriate and harmful material.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the long road out of Ukraine, how Madrid taxi drivers have played their part helping refugees fleeing the fighting.
It is now important that all of us in Europe
act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and me, Juliet Mann. Our top stories. Survivors emerge from the Mariupol theatre Ukraine says was targeted by Russian shells, but the number of casualties are still to be established.
Our other headlines, Ukraine's president evokes Germany's divided history, saying Berlin must lead the way in stopping Russia building a new Iron Curtain across Europe.
And the war in Ukraine could knock more than 1% off global growth this year, a stark warning from the OECD.
It's 3 weeks since Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, and so far it is unclear which, if any, of its military objectives have been met.
A number of analysts, Western politicians and intelligence services have said the operation has largely stalled and that Russia underestimated both the scale and the competence of Ukraine's military resistance.
Well, Chris Bellamy is Professor Emeritus of Maritime Security at the University of Greenwich and an expert on Russia's military. Professor Bellamy, welcome. Is it too early to call this Russian invasion a military failure?
It is, I think. It has certainly stalled. It's stalled for a number of reasons. The first is that clearly the Russians expected to take Kiev and other major cities in a few days. We're now in it's been 3 weeks, and they've only got Kherson, and they're still trying to get Mariupol. There was a report earlier today from Kharkiv that they haven't encircled that city yet. So they have stalled. There's a saying in military history, amateurs talk about tactics, professionals talk about logistics. And I think one of the reasons for the stalling is that they're probably running out of ammunition and they've got to stop to get more. And also they may be running out of fuel. There have also been reports, I'm not sure, I can't verify them, but some of the Russian soldiers actually shot holes in their own petrol tanks so they couldn't move forward. I think the fact that the Russian troops and their officers were told that the Ukrainians would welcome them as liberators were obviously lies and or misguided anyway. So Russian morale has dropped, I think, very badly. And it's one possibly related to that. We've just heard that the 4th Russian Major General, Oleg Matyev, commanding 150th Rifle Division, was killed near to Mariupol. So the Russians have about 20 major generals in Ukraine, and to lose 4 of them is going it some.
Let me ask you, how much of Ukraine's success, if we can use that word, how much of Ukraine's performance so far is about the international support it's received in terms of international intelligence, international training and international hardware?
I think that's hugely important. I particularly think intelligence, clearly the intelligence that the Ukrainians received must have been very good, and the fact that they're able to target major generals with, in some cases, snipers means they must have a pretty good idea of where they are. In terms of hardware, yes, the Ukrainians have been trained to use man-portable air defense systems, Starstreak, and also new generation light anti-tank weapons, and these are clearly having a major effect in stopping Russian armour.
Chris Bellamy, Professor Emeritus of Maritime Security at the University of Greenwich, thank you very much indeed for your analysis.
My pleasure.
More than 3 million Ukrainians have fled the country since Russia invaded. 55 Ukrainian children become refugees every minute as families flee the violence. The majority of people crossing into neighbouring countries are women and children. Our correspondent Natalie Carney reports from one of the busiest border crossings between Ukraine and Poland.
Every day, Poland sees an average of 40,000 people arrive from Ukraine. 6,000 of them enter from the Korchowa border crossing and are then brought 10 kilometers to here.
This used to be the Korchowa shopping mall, but with the high number of arrivals from Ukraine continuing to enter this border town in East Poland, it's been converted into a reception center.
All day and night, buses come and go, offloading those who have just arrived and helping others with their onward journey. Food, bathrooms, and medical care are all available, as is psychological help for those who need it. Every day, different humanitarian corridors open up in Ukraine, allowing short periods of time for residents in those areas to gather their things and leave. Their experiences under bombardment and the journey just to get here can be terrifying, says Olina, who fled Irpin once her city became unlivable.
All the bridges have been destroyed. People couldn't live in Irpin, so evacuations took place. Firstly, we wanted to go by train, but the railway tracks were bombed, so we were evacuated by buses. Our military and territorial defense helped to take us out.
Inside the center, fresh arrivals are given a small cot to sleep on, a blanket, and access to a variety of aid organizations and representatives from different EU countries who can help them understand their options. While many Ukrainians move on to meet friends and family elsewhere in Poland or other EU countries, others, like 20-year-old Sofia, don't know what to do next.
I have 6 months left to study at university to get a higher education. Probably, most likely, I won't graduate. So I will have to find something in another country, learn something new, look for a new job, where to live. I just have to start life all over again from scratch.
For children, the effects of their experiences might not be understood until they are older.
Firstly, we came from Bucha to Kiev, and from there we came here. It wasn't scary. Okay, maybe just a little bit. My dad stayed at home because he said there are some people with guns going around breaking glass. I don't know where we're going now.
I just don't know.
As the conflict in Ukraine continues and people, including children, continue to die, those that made it out are the lucky ones. The question now, what next? Natalie Carney, CGTN, Gorzowa, Poland.
European countries further away from Ukraine are also welcoming refugees. CGTN's correspondent Rahul Pathak met Madrid taxi drivers who played their part in helping those fleeing the fighting reach safety.
A hero's welcome for the Ukrainian refugees fleeing their country. Exhausted after 3 weeks of conflict and a 3,000-kilometre trip from the Polish border, there is now finally relief. The 30 taxi drivers from Madrid that signed up were largely self-funded. It was yet another incredible act of kindness at a time of great uncertainty in Europe.
They were just so grateful, really grateful for what we did for them. I was driving 3 people, all aged over 70, and they were just so charming with all of us. They really appreciated what we did. At first, they were a little bit nervous, but as soon as they realized this was actually for real and we were driving them to Spain, they were really, really happy.
Some of those who made the journey have family members living in Spain. Others will be allocated homes or temporary shelter. This NGO, Messengers of Peace, is run entirely by volunteers who will help provide food and accommodation. Medical and psychological services will also be offered to those in need. Well, this caravan of taxis behind me has just made the 6,000-kilometre round trip from Madrid to the Polish border back to Madrid. Now, on their outward journey, they brought essential humanitarian aid from Spain, and on their return, as you can see, they've brought back Ukrainian refugees, many of them exhausted, all of them relieved. This mother of 2, who worked as a doctor, did not want to give her name for fear of reprisals on her husband. He's back in Ukraine fighting in one of the worst hit areas of the country.
We had to leave because of the bombs. We are from Kharkiv, and it was completely destroyed. We were lucky to escape. I don't know how to thank the love and support from everyone here. It almost makes you want to forget what just happened.
Over 3 million Ukrainians have fled the country, and these are the lucky ones. After the euphoria and relief of their escape subside, thoughts will inevitably return to the safety of those left behind. Rahul Pathak, CGTN, Madrid.
Steel manufacturers in Japan are preparing to diversify their supply chains as the United States and its allies move to impose more financial sanctions against Russia.
They're facing great uncertainty in the global market and pressure from rising costs. Our correspondent Phoebe Amoroso reports.
As sanctions against Russia disrupt global supply chains, Japanese steelmakers are rethinking their trade relationships. Nippon Steel is one of the world's biggest producers. It gets 14% of the iron ore used in its manufacturing process from Russia and Ukraine. The company says it's talked with alternative suppliers and might start importing from Brazil and Australia instead. Analysts say they expect the impact on the market to be short-term.
Companies will have to switch to a different export supplier for iron ore and other resources to make up for the amount they cannot import from Russia, or change the institutions used for financial transactions, as there will be some extra cost involved. However, I don't think the global supply chain structure will be significantly impacted by this.
Imports of iron ore from Russia to Japan are relatively small, but the biggest concern for Japanese manufacturers lies in soaring energy and resource prices. JFE Holdings says it's facing pressure. Last year, its steel subsidiary bought almost a fifth of its coking coal from Russia. The company group said it is looking into alternative sources.
According to analysts at JP Morgan, prices of iron ore and coking coal have already risen on expectations for a recovery in demand, among other factors. They say that a potential disruption to supplies from Russia could delay a return to normal pricing, but Japanese steelmakers should be able to cope by raising prices.
The EU banned imports of Russian steel this week, and there's uncertainty over what measures might be imposed next.
Going forward, we need to pay attention to secondary sanctions that might be imposed by the US and others. Right now, there are still many loopholes being provided. those could be closed, for example, by limiting financial transactions via China.
Japan has taken a strong stance towards Moscow, imposing wide-reaching sanctions, but it has yet to ban steel imports like the EU or oil imports like the US. The Japanese government says it will continue to cooperate with G7 countries as the crisis continues. Phoebe Amoroso, CGTN, Tokyo.
You're watching CGTN. Reunited with her family, the British Iranian woman released by Tehran after 6 years in jail.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Tents here, bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Gas. So it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated. Is the front line now after 9 days of fighting?
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from
the front clear
line.
View of this front line position.
Have you ever wondered how much a human life is worth?
Have you ever looked up at the night sky and considered whether aliens are staring back? Or if it's even possible to measure intelligence?
If that sounds like you, it's time to join the Answers Project with me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge.
We've recruited the best brains in the world, award-winning astrophysicists, giants of medical science, and former presidential advisors to help us tackle humanity's biggest questions.
Find the answers wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, the British-Iranian national imprisoned in Iran for 6 years, has been reunited with her husband and her daughter. Another jailed dual citizen, Anousheh Dashuri, was also released.
It's led to speculation the UK is rebuilding diplomatic relations with Tehran amid a growing squeeze in energy supplies. Our correspondent Guy Henderson reports.
This was the moment her family had been longing for. At first, just a photograph provided proof. It was only several hours later, when the plane touched down, that the freedom of British-Iranian citizens Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and Anousheh Dashuri really sunk in.
That's my dad.
Nazanin's 7-year-old daughter and husband Richard watched from the terminal building outside London.
Mummy!
That's Mummy.
Then moments later, the reunion. Hidden from view, but the emotion still obvious. Loved ones had been holding off on celebrations. There'd been failed deals before, and this one clearly wasn't simple either.
There's the expectation that they would be released, but we weren't sure right until the last minute, so it's been very emotional, but also a really happy moment for the families.
The previous day, husband Richard had suggested some in Tehran had worried about what tales from detention may emerge on his wife's return.
It's been bumpy. You know, there have been some sort of, scary conversations in the last couple of days as well of people just trying to, make sure that she would be well behaved when she came back.
Nazanin was jailed in 2016 on spurious charges of plotting against the Iranian government. Ashuri's time came a year later, this time accused of spying for Israel and acquiring illegitimate wealth. Human rights groups say the regime uses foreign prisoners as pawns, something it denies. Iranian-American father and son Bakir and Siamak Amazi are still being held. Another British-Iranian, conservationist Murad Tabaz, is on what's been described as furlough, but hasn't yet been able to leave the country. The timing seems convenient. Just as the West cuts oil imports from Russia over its invasion of Ukraine, a sign it could be patching up ties with an oil-rich nation currently still under sanctions. Officials from both sides confirmed Britain had settled a £400 million debt to Tehran shortly before this breakthrough, but Iran denies a link.
The release of these two individuals was done with a humanitarian outlook by the Islamic Republic of Iran. and reports that acquiring the funds led to the release of these individuals is incorrect and inaccurate.
Politics aside, two families who'd been living a nightmare are now happily together again. That will give hope to others still stuck in one. Guy Henderson, CGTN.
China has reported some 20,000 new local COVID cases in the past 2 weeks in the latest surge of the virus. There are more than 1,200 new infections on the mainland, while a similar number of asymptomatic infections were also recorded. The worst-hit province of Jilin reported over 700 cases.
Germany will spend up to $3 billion securing COVID-19 vaccines to help contain future outbreaks over the next 7 years. The move comes as Germany grapples with record infection rates. Despite the surge, restrictions are set to ease in many parts of the country.
4 times Formula One world champion Sebastian Vettel will miss the season-opening Bahrain Grand Prix after testing positive for coronavirus. The Aston Martin driver will be replaced by Germany's Nico Hülkenberg for this weekend's race. Vettel could be back for the second Grand Prix in Saudi Arabia on the 27th of March.
South by Southwest, the popular music, film and tech festival, is back in Austin, Texas, in person for the first time in 3 years.
And that means a much-needed boost for the music scene since struggling through the pandemic. Our correspondent Tony Waterman now reports.
There's a reason why Austin is known as the live music capital of the world. In this city, you're never far from its vibrations. But in 2020, as the pandemic took hold, Austin fell silent. Even as music festivals like South by Southwest return, those in the industry say things are nowhere close to being back to normal.
The impact has been almost unexplainable, inexplicable.
Berklee College of Music grad Hannah Barakat has been living and working in Austin for 7 years. Before COVID, she says she was playing sometimes 4 gigs a day. Now she's been forced to take on odd jobs like working in a parking garage or picking up more hours on this party bus to make ends meet.
I sold my acoustic guitar that my dad bought me for graduation from Berklee. I sold any microphone, any extra accessory, any preamps. I sold everything but my car.
Multiple rounds of stimulus and musician relief packages have offered little more, Hannah says, than a temporary lifeline.
There are an estimated 8,000 working musicians living here in Austin, playing at hundreds of venues across the city. Music is one of the main drivers of the local economy, and South by Southwest alone is expected to inject $16 million into the music industry. But many of the actual musicians themselves are barely scraping by.
In the most recent Austin music census, half of the respondents said they were earning less than $25,000 a year, with a large number of them living under the poverty line.
A lot of the issues that we're facing now stem from issues that we were facing before the pandemic, and those include affordability.
According to Zillow, Austin is now one of the least affordable places for home buyers. The high cost of living, says Pat Bucha, is forcing many musicians to leave, threatening the city's status as the live music capital of the world.
When we start to lose the very thing that makes this city special, and that really is our economic driver more than anything, then we become just like anywhere else.
Hannah Barakat says she has no plans of quitting the industry.
I'm stubborn as hell, and this has been my goal and my dream since I was a child.
But that doesn't mean she won't pursue that dream somewhere else. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Austin, Texas.
The crack is back. Dublin's St Patrick's Day parade has returned in all its green glory after COVID cancelled the celebrations for 2 years. Tens of thousands of visitors joined residents of the Irish capital to celebrate the country's patron saint. They were treated to marching bands, dancers and, of course, hospitality at many pubs serving Guinness. The guest of honour at this year's parade being the American-Irish actor John C. Reilly.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
Coming up next on CGTN Africa Live. See you tomorrow. Same time, same place. From all the team here in London. Goodbye.
Goodbye.